So now I'm going to start and introduce our speakers today. We're very fortunate in having Ed Collins, who is the international representative for the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers and the Executive Vice President at Large for the Massachusetts AFL-CIO. He was a rank and file member, IBEW member from 1966 to 1973. He then became the business manager for Local 455, and then he became a representative to the International Union, and he's been a state federation, Massachusetts State AFL-CIO Federation officer since 1985. He's also the past co-chair of the Massachusetts COSH board. And our second speaker is going to be Tolly Graham, who is an occupational health and environmental trainer and organizer at MASCOSH, which stands for the Massachusetts Coalition for Occupational Safety and Health. MASCOSH is a coalition of unions, occupational health and legal professionals, and community groups who are dedicated to improving workplace health and safety and building healthy communities. Tolly has worked as an advocate and occupational health and environmental trainer for 25 years. She is past president of the National COSH Council and a member of the United Steelworkers Union, and I think you're going to find their presentations really interesting to see how green chemistry is being applied in on the shop floor and in the labor movement. So Ed, please begin. Thank you.
Thank you, Len. Good afternoon, everyone. So in 2009, the Massachusetts AFL-CIO designated something called the Safer Alternatives to Toxic Chemicals Bill as a priority bill for the safety and security plank of its legislative agenda. Today we'll present how this alliance was built in Massachusetts between sometimes unlikely partners, unions and traditional environmental groups. We will discuss labor union strategies to ensure a collective worker voice in the workplace technology decisions, including resource tool, the recently completed NIEHS-funded Train the Trainer Green Chemistry Awareness Curriculum developed by MASCOSH and the New England Consortium at the University of Massachusetts Lowell. We hope this presentation will offer some useful insights and information that is applicable to national chemical reform efforts as well as for the labor environmental coalitions that exist in other states. So the Alliance for Healthy Tomorrow, we need to go to the next slide, I guess. I don't want to get ahead of the audience here. The Alliance for Healthy Tomorrow is an organization that came together around this issue primarily of labor community alliances for health and safety. It's a coalition of citizens, scientists, health professionals, workers, and educators seeking to do preventative action on toxic hazards. And its goal was to develop proactive policies to prevent harm before the damage is done and to choose the safest alternatives. The group is part of a broader movement in the so-called Safer States, a national coalition that includes 14 state-based environmental coalitions, some of which, those in California, Maine, New Jersey, as well as Massachusetts, have participation by the labor movement. So we need the next slide. Okay. Labor was identified as a key stakeholder by the Alliance for a Healthy Tomorrow pretty early on. Sort of the lead organization in getting this particular effort underway was Clean Water Action, an environmental group based here in Massachusetts, and they solicited funds from foundation grants to support staff work on the part of key groups to do the basic organizing to bring the Alliance for a Healthy Tomorrow really into being. And MASCOSH was able to focus significant time and outreach to for the involvement of organized labor. Had two part-time staff people really dedicated to doing this work for several years in the initial stages. MassCOSH itself, as you might have gathered from Lynn's introduction, is a labor-based organization. It really has a long history of working with industrial health and safety professionals and the labor movement going all the way back to 1975. And it's been instrumental in several legislative campaigns here in Massachusetts, the original state right to know law here, and more recently work targeting toxic substances such as the cleaning solutions and flammable floor finishing products like lacquer sealer. There's a lot of work. It sounds, I think, to people who are not familiar with sometimes what can be described as Byzantine politics of the labor movement. You know, a lot of people think that you approach a statewide umbrella organization such as the AFL-CIO, and if you get them to support it, that the work is done. But it really doesn't work that way. The Massachusetts AFL-CIO is a statewide umbrella organization of the labor movement, but it's broken down geographically to subordinate bodies called central labor councils that at one time were actually based on a county-by-county basis. Isn't quite that way anymore. It covers often a little broader territory than a single county, but each of them, you have to really get buy-in from each of those central labor councils to do a successful statewide legislative campaign, because they're the ones that interact directly with the state representatives and state senators in their districts, and the ones that the key legislative players are going to pay the most attention to. So a lot of the organizing that went on with that paid staff was in going labor council to labor council and making the case for unions to devote some time and energy into this campaign with the when they're pulled in you know, dozens of different directions on public policy matters. Mass AFL-CIO, as we mentioned, put the Safer Alternatives Bill on their safety and security legislative agenda plank in 2009, and recruited other state coalitions to be involved and central labor bodies to be involved as the legislative campaign moved forward. Can we have the next slide, please? So I want to talk a little bit about the tools that unions have for dealing with health and safety issues, and particularly exposure to toxic substances in the workplace. The first being our most traditional mechanism, which is collective bargaining. And unions have long had as part of their collective bargaining agenda mechanisms to deal with health and safety problems in the workplace, to create safety committees, to gain, you know, meaningful input into changes in technology and in somewhat limited other limited circumstances, maybe even products that are being used, and to bargain over, to exercise our right under the National Labor Relations Act, to bargain over any workplace changes that affect wages, hours, or terms and conditions of employment. Safety being, you know, a term and condition of employment that is a mandatory subject of collective bargaining, and to make sure that, you know, unions and workers through their unions have full information on technologies that impact them on the job and impact them as workers. Something that I'll spend a couple of minutes talking about is the right of unions to have independent analysis of technologies, work processes, and other you know, matters that impact on worker health and safety. This is, well, it's not new anymore, but you know, 20 years ago, this was a fairly cutting-edge area of labor law, and actually the local union that I used to be the business manager of, Local 455 in Springfield, Massachusetts, was involved in what is still, I think, the leading case before the National Labor Relations Board that established the right of unions to bring their own independent industrial hygienist or other safety and health professional into a workplace, even over an employer's objections, to analyze safety and health conditions and exposures to toxic substances. And the case actually arose around a noise issue, an excessive noise issue. And the National Labor Relations Board issued a decision against the employer in Holyoke, Massachusetts, saying that the employer's duty to bargain with the union and to supply the union with sufficient information to bargain effectively and intelligently over health and safety, which is a mandatory subject of bargaining, extended to the point of the union not having to accept a company-hired safety and health expert's opinion about a matter that affected worker health and safety, that they had the right to bring their own independent safety experts into the work site, as I said before, even if the company objected and the company was citing its private property rights as that they had the right to decide who got to come into their industrial facility. That case actually went all the way to the United States Court of Appeals, and the employer in that case attempted to get it before the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court had denied, did not give them cert, and that's a case that's still cited quite a bit today. Some of the other things in the union's toolbox are at the national and international level. Unions are involved in many of the regulatory writing panels and boards that come up with standards to once legislation is passed and regulations have to be written. Unions from the industries that are most effective, particularly in Democratic administrations, but in Republican administrations as well, almost always have some seats at the table to help influence how those regulations are going to look before they're adopted. Could we go to the next slide, please? Okay. Labor priorities became AHT priorities, and that was largely as a result of the work of the Labor Advisory Committee that was formed fairly early on by AHT, mainly because the unions, as part of being as a sort of a condition of being part of the coalition, felt that they really needed a voice for a mechanism by which the unions that were involved met independently and discussed policy issues and came to a consensus position on how we would move forward in support of this sort of effort, legislative effort. And among the things that came out of that were the inclusion of a just transition provision to the Safer Alternatives bill. And just transition concept is one that is most identified with the late Tony Mazzocchi, who was Secretary-Treasurer of the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union. And the idea basically is that any worker that may lose their job or suffer some form of industrial relocation as a result of public policy intended to clean the environment ought not to have to pay the economic price, that they ought to be entitled to such things as a level of retraining that would qualify them to not suffer a significant reduction in their standard of living. For far too long, our job retraining efforts in the United States, whether it be for dislocation due to trade or other forms of public policy, have been quite content, and I know this firsthand from having sat for a number of years on the employment boards that handle retraining funds that come from the federal government, that if they are able to achieve a 60 or 70% reemployment at 60 to 70% of the former wage, they consider that a success. Well, we didn't consider that a success, and we felt that there was a need in any legislation that we were going to support in Massachusetts to do better by the people whose livelihoods were going to be possibly called into question or downgraded as a result of some of the change. Now, this became sort of a problem in a sense for us in a number of ways in dealing with this, because on the one hand, the Safer Alternatives bill that we were lobbying for, we were saying would cause an absolute minimum of economic dislocation, because it was not a bill that simply mandated that we ban substances or, go find a substitute for a toxic substance without regard to the economic impact. In fact, the economic impact of doing the substitution was an important factor in the state determining whether or not to push a particular industry to move forward and substitute. And the bill did permit, you went on a use-by-use basis, so that it might be that there's a fairly simple substitute for a toxic chemical in one industry that simply wouldn't be a fit for another, and so you could have different results with the economic impact being weighed as part of it. So on the one hand, we are arguing that the bill would create very minimal economic dislocation, and what we were getting pushback from on the part of not just legislators, but cabinet members in a Democratic administration that were our friends, were saying, well, if you're telling us on the one hand that this isn't going to cause any real job loss, any significant job loss, why do you need these extra benefits? And we argued back very forcefully that, and I can remember in particular the woman who was at the time Secretary of Labor. She is not any longer. It's someone else that fills that role now. But I remember arguing back that, look, we were trying to establish a point here, and precisely because we don't expect there to be any significant job loss as a result of enactment of the bill, it's not going to cost the state very much to set a very high benchmark for how we should deal with such matters in general when we pursue public policies that result in industrial dislocation of workers. That this was a freebie, if you will. This was an opportunity for state government to lay down a marker on what the right way was to treat dislocated workers when we're creating new public policy that has the potential to cause industrial dislocation, but it's one where it would be very limited in how it would end up being used. But we hope to be basically setting a bar and setting an example. That was the idea. So if I could go to the next and last slide for my part of the presentation. Okay, so the bill was written and filed in 2003. It builds upon an existing law, the Massachusetts Toxic Use Reduction Act. Labor has a seat on the advisory committee, which is the committee that recommends which chemicals, and it's kind of a rolling process. You would start out with a fairly limited list of about 10 of the worst actors, and there's a process by which additional chemicals can be added as time goes on. And Labor has as I say, a seat on that board that considers what the next targets would be. It provides for technical assistance grants for the impact of chemical substitution on companies and on workers, independent technical support to assist companies in analyzing other technologies or processes or changes in the way work is organized in order to effectuate a just transition. And I think I probably used more than the time that I was allotted already, so I'm going to bring my part of it to an end and ask, oh, I guess I should mention to you that the bill actually has passed in the last session, the Massachusetts Senate, but has not passed the House yet. And it remains, as we go into this new two-year legislative cycle of the Massachusetts legislature, one of the priority bills of the Massachusetts AFL-CIO. Now, and I will also, in the interest of full disclosure and fairness, mention to you that last year was a very difficult year for us, as it was for just about every state in the country. And most of organized labor's legislative effort was expended in just trying to hang on, particularly on the, for the public employees, hang on to what we have. And we certainly didn't experience the sort of full frontal assault on collective bargaining in the public sector that states like Wisconsin, Ohio, Indiana, and New Hampshire have. But you know, nevertheless, even in what is generally thought of as a labor-friendly environment, we've had to fight to hang on to some things that we never thought that we would have to fight to retain. And so in such an environment, you know, pushing the ball forward takes a back seat to hanging on to what you have. But we're going to be back this year with it. Again, it is still a priority bill for the Massachusetts AFL-CIO. So at this point, I think I should turn it over to Tali to talk about her part of the program.
Okay, thank you, Ed. So this is Tali Graham from MassCosh, and I want to introduce a green chemistry train-the-trainer curriculum that we developed as another tool and resource to build this awareness around green chemistry and to help foster, strengthen these labor environmental health coalitions. So we were very lucky to have one of our colleagues at UMass Lowell New England Consortium, particularly Craig Slayton, who succeeded in receiving this NIEHS training grant for the Train the Trainer curriculum. I was, at MassCosh, coordinated the development of the curriculum with a great team that I just want to do some quick acknowledgments. Joel Tickner from the Lowell Center for Sustainable Production and his former colleague Melissa Coffin, Amy Cannon from Beyond Benign Foundation, and Tom Esterbrook, who's a TNEC trainer and union activist from UMass Lowell. And I also want to acknowledge and thank the Tony Mazzocchi Center for Safety, Health, and the Environment Education Center. It's a project of the United Steelworkers and the Labor Institute for allowing us to use and modify portions of their green chemistry, green jobs, green health curriculum. Next slide, please. Is it okay? So goals. This was a 4-hour train-the-trainer curriculum for labor and environmental health activists. The goal was to advocate for making a transition to green chemistry and safer chemical alternatives, and to expand our awareness and network of advocates, activists, primarily in Massachusetts and Connecticut, and mostly that was because of ability of people to travel and be able to do this economically. Next slide, please. Our curriculum approach was based on popular education techniques with a focus on people's own experiences as they relate to the information and the activities, so that they can consider the changes in their workplaces or communities needed to promote this shift in the way that we look at toxics, green chemistry, and safer alternatives. We use small group reading, responding activities. So for example, we read a case study on the history of how plywood has been made, including a piece on use of new safer soy-based materials, which was very challenging in our discussion to look at the trade-offs when we consider new materials that are put on the market. We felt really strongly about getting people up and moving, and we used this fun activity based on Amy Cannon's work, which was we made glue, where people worked in small teams of 2 as if they were in a cooking class. We had, hot plates and ingredients, and we actually made glue. And I will explain a little bit more about that in a minute. Next slide. And then we finally, our training approach included engaging our activist networks led by our trainers to incorporate examples of current campaigns on policy work to promote green chemistry and safer alternatives. And you can see some of the logos of the partners: our Green Justice Coalition in Massachusetts, the Alliance for Healthy Tomorrow, Coalition for a Safe and Healthy Connecticut, efforts by Clean Water Action, and others. And now I'm just going to show you some of the posters we used in the various activities and explain a little bit more about it. So next slide, please. So I will not read all of these learning objectives for each of the 5 activities, but to say that there were 5 activities for this 4-hour Train the Trainer. They were designed so that each activity could be used on its own with some modifications, and this worked well for our trainers who used these materials in very different settings, which I will talk about in a little bit. So next slide, please. This poster was used in the activity that I spoke of earlier, making glue, our cooking activity, and this is where we introduced the 12 green chemistry principles. Cost and performance have been the traditional features which chemical and product designers use, and in most cases, I think we know that health and environmental considerations have been viewed as an add-on and not an integral part of designing a new chemical. So through this exercise, participants observe firsthand some of the ways in which chemical processes can be wasteful. They follow fun and sometimes absurd instructions like jumping up and down and using a quarter of a cup of milk and throwing away the rest of the gallon as they learn about how chemical processes can be redesigned using the 12 principles. So with our feedback from our trainers, we developed this poster that you're looking at, which essentially groups the 12 principles into 4 buckets. And then the numbers next to them that are on parentheses align with the 12 principles, which is on a fact sheet that they each participant has. So our trainers use this poster to make it easier to apply these principles. When the small groups rewrote the steps to make glue in what they thought was a more green way, they posted those steps on this poster where they thought those steps applied to these green chemistry principles. So they put their steps in one of these 4 buckets, shall we say. Next slide, please. Since most of our trainings included workers and union health and safety activists as well as environmental activists, we wanted to present the pollution prevention as well as the worker health and safety frameworks that they may have been more familiar with for addressing pollution and workplace hazards. Again, with feedback from our Train the Trainer session, this poster was redesigned so that the P2 and the hierarchy of controls for workplace health and safety were put side by side. And we thought that this was a very important piece of our training because we had to sort of challenge ourselves to sort of look at this as a total combined approach as opposed to one or the other. After participants were introduced to the 12 green chemistry principles, we put this poster up next to the poster that had the 4 buckets of the green chemistry principles. And then we basically asked, how do the green chemistry principles fit in these frameworks? And then if there is time, as I said, these trainings were modified by our trainers, we would ask people to move their sticky notes from the buckets, the 12 green principles, and see where it would fit on this hierarchy poster to make it a little bit more real. Again, our training method focused on using participants' own experience and then reflecting on how the newer information that is the green chemistry principles, fits, enhances, or changes their usual approach to environmental health and safety. Next slide, please. The next two slides are our final examples of posters developed for our training. And they are pasted together. It's very hard in a PowerPoint presentation to see this. It was really a large sort of mural-sized poster on the wall. It's a multi-layered timeline from 1900 to 2010 that displays historical snapshots for chemical use, their consequences, policy outcomes, and social movements that developed over time. And we asked the participants to put themselves on the map, noting a significant experience or milestone that impacted them. And then they posted their experiences on the timeline. We looked at the timeline again to discuss as a large group how we've managed toxic chemicals over these years. Next slide. So this is the other part of the poster, and I apologize for it being so difficult to really visualize in this format. Next slide, please. These were just a few of the reflections that we pulled out, and you can see that some of them go way back to when someone was a 5-year-old picking up a dead fish in Lake Erie, all the way to someone who got sick at work themselves, or had an understanding of involved in a campaign where there was a solvent contaminating the groundwater in their hometown when they were in high school. So we moved from basically talking about people's own experiences to what are some of the solutions or ways to take action. And the people that our trainers, this was the opportunity for them to present a campaign that they were currently engaged in. And so, for example, the Alliance for Healthy Tomorrow, we were able to talk about the Safer Alternatives bill at one of the trainings, and I'll show you a little bit more of some of the other trainings in a minute. But we wanted to get people to really start to think about what would they do and how could they get involved. Next slide, please. So here are some of the examples of groups who hosted the trainings. And we had janitors from 1199 at a hospital in Connecticut. Many had been involved in green cleaning programs and had health and safety backgrounds. But this was a way to build awareness about this new concept. We had high school students trained. We modified the curriculum in Boston through the Green Justice Coalition to look specifically at some of the materials that are being used in weatherizing residences and the issue about the foam hazards of the foam insulation and other greener products in building materials. And finally, most recently, we did this training for the National Health and Safety Summit that the COSHs organized this past fall. Last slide, please. This last slide is just a little bit of feedback from some of the evaluations from the training. And as you see, they are also, some of them very personal and some of them moving people towards action. And we have the, let me see, I should have put this on the slides, and perhaps we can do this afterwards on the website. Put the link where people can access the curriculum and the materials. They are now all on the web, either at NIHS or at UMass Lowell, but I will get Lynn the correct link, and I will end, and hopefully we will have a little bit of a time for discussion.
Thank you so much, Ed and Tali. I thought that was really interesting, and I want to open it now for questions and comments. Feel free to just jump right in, raise your hand, and type your questions. So I'm very interested in hearing about how how different unions have been responding to this. And is there, are unions in some industries more interested than in others? And how has that been approached in terms of, interesting different unions in different sectors?
Well, the short answer is yes. Industries and unions in some industries are more interested than others, and the other thing that goes right along with that is unions in some industries are more deeply concerned and anxious about this type of a legislative initiative than are others. And it's probably not a big surprise that unions who see very little or perhaps even no impact on the livelihoods of their members are much easier to get on board to support it than those where there is a perceived negative impact. But it's really the whole thing has been a very interesting and really terrific process from my point of view, from both sides, from the labor side and from the environmental community side. From the union side, being able to assure unions that to assuage most of their deepest concerns anyway. I won't say that we were always successful in addressing everything, but because even leaders, even when you get union leaders to a point where they can see that this makes sense and it's the right thing to do, they are political animals. They have to be elected. People at the local union level have to be elected. And when the employer that their members work for is still not on board, and when employers do come on board, it's usually a long time after the unions have, they can very easily rattle membership to the point where it puts political pressure on local union leaders to not to be as strident and bold about moving forward with something that they themselves have been convinced is the thing to do. So that's kind of a tricky, tricky business, and you have to deal with it, leader by leader, union by union, industry by industry. But on the other side of it, I think what I am heartened by is that over the years that we've been trying to do this, I think within a large part of the environmental community, certainly not everyone, but in a large part, I think we've been able to bring about a much broader understanding of the economic insecurity that many environmental initiatives present to organized workers, and why, at least at the beginning, they may react the way they do to new environmental initiatives. And also, I think we've done a lot of work in trying to get people to understand, how organized workers react to the concept of, oh, this is going to create more jobs than it destroys, so what's the problem? Because very often when you peel back a layer or two of the onion on that argument, even if on its surface it's factual, it becomes trading in good, solid, middle-class, high-paying, secure jobs with benefits for low-wage, non-union, insecure jobs. And even if you created a few more of those at the expense of an almost as large number of more solid jobs, you haven't really accomplished very much. And so I think there's a far broader understanding of some of those issues on the part of those environmental organizations that we've interacted with in this process than there ever was before.
Thank you. That's great. I find that so interesting. We have a question here about whether you can get the presentation. And as we said at the beginning, these are being recorded, and they will be posted on the Great Lakes Green Chemistry Network webpage, glgc.org. I can't promise you when exactly that will be, because we are revamping the website now and uploading a lot of our past our past webinars, but keep checking in because it should be up within the next couple of weeks, I hope. And then you can just...
Certainly, I will forward you the link for the Green Chemistry Train-the-Trainer curriculum.
And I'll post that on the website as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. So in the next question, let's see, was how did you get on the crowded agenda of the CLCs? How much time did they give you to present? And what worked best when pitching the issue?
Well, for one thing, one reason why it was important to have somebody like Mathcosh have some dedicated staff time is that we're also union members, and a lot of our board members are members of labor council. So we were basically doing organizing, as Ed said, amongst our peers, but being very methodical about it. So, you know, it really wasn't that hard to become a, you know, invited guest to talk about it. And what we also did, what a lot of good organizers do, is we identified who were some important union leaders, key people in those councils, and we went and had coffee with them and talked this up with them because some of them had elected positions on the state AFL-CIO executive board, and at that point we had to go to the state Fed and say, we have all these labor councils that are on board with us, and we would like your endorsement as well. And maybe Ed can say something a little bit about that process.
Yeah, I mean, actually, Tali described it quite well, and we also had, you know, some significant buy-in from the top leadership of the Massachusetts AFL-CIO fairly early on. But it's a large board. There are 52 members on the statewide AFL-CIO board, and you know, within that group, there certainly were people who were reluctant and a little bit anxious about the whole process. So building it, you know, Central Labor Council by Central Labor Council by Central Labor Council, and taking the time it took to do that over a period of many months, we made sure that when it did, and I left out a step actually, that the Massachusetts AFL-CIO has a annual education conference that's about 2.5 days, right at the early summer, and getting a major spot on that agenda right before we actually went before the board for an endorsement, so that there was some time for a more in-depth discussion among, you know, the whole board was going to be exposed to, and questions and answers, and you know, addressing the concerns. You know, basically made a big difference in getting board. And once you get them on board, basically when you have to go back every year to try to, you know, keep it the emphasis on it, like most things, once you've won the argument, usually it's not controversial.
I just wanted to add one quick thing, because I know time is flying here, is that the really powerful benefit of having the State Federation of Labor on board came through when, during our lobbying for the Safer Alternatives bill, one of our big defense plants was crying wolf and saying if they had to substitute stuff, they'd have to leave the state, blah, blah, blah. They really scared their members. The union got really nervous, and we were basically able to get the union at least to be silent on the matter rather than, you know, showing their fear publicly. And we actually ended up negotiating a sidebar that defense plants would be exempt at this point from the bill. But it just sort of gives you an example of some of the political involvement that's really necessary.
I just want to make sure that everybody knows that a CLC is a Central Labor Council. So the next question, I have 2 more questions, so I'm going to rush to try to get them in. The next question is from Dorothy, who says, I was struck by how the triangle you used to bring together pollution prevention and the hierarchy of controls doesn't mention prevention. As you know, I've been trying to get the word included in how we talk about fixing hazards and to emphasize solutions that really do prevent them, like green chemistry. What thoughts do you have about how we try to talk more about prevention so that it's easier to talk about green chemistry and similar kinds of solutions given the multiple audiences?
Well, I'll have to have a sidebar with her on this. But I absolutely respect Dorothy's approach to health and safety, and I know she's really good at this. So we may be looking at a revision 2 of this poster. And I'd be happy to hear her suggestions.
Well, I think it's good that it's, you know, like green chemistry, it's a dynamic process, and you're always striving, if you will, for continuous improvement. So that sounds
exactly. Yeah, and I mean the
very
other thing that I just might want to remind people is that, you know, participants were posting their perceptions, their ideas about how to make glue in a green way, and so some of the prevention stuff may have come in there in those steps that they posted on this as part of this activity.
Well, and I always think that the tip of the pyramid really is all about prevention. I mean, that's you know, in terms of the hierarchy of controls, the first one is to prevent the exposure in the first place, so or to eliminate the hazard. So the next question I have that I want to get in here before we are finished is, has a criteria been established for robust alternatives assessment so that regrettable substitutions do not have an adverse impact on society? For example, the rush to eliminate DDT from the planet has led to millions of people dying from malaria in tropical areas after affected communities stopped using it. And I'm going to actually jump in with a short comment on that. You know, there was never an overt ban on DDT outside of the United States in many of the countries which have problems of malaria. It's always been an incremental process, and I think that many of the alternatives that have been found have been quite effective, actually, particularly since many of the mosquitoes and insects are becoming resistant to DDT. So I think your question is absolutely spot on in terms of alternatives assessment, and I think that the Massachusetts folks are probably really good people to answer that question.
I guess I would comment on it in terms of the Safer Alternatives bill and the way it was drafted, and I think we tried to do this in a way that recognized that none of us are as smart as we at times think we are, and that there are going to be, and that's why the approach was flexible. The approach was, you know, substitute perhaps in industry A but not industry B because there were different consequences, but it also provided for an ongoing kind of dynamic process where if unintended consequences are uncovered, you know, it's not what our opponents tried to paint it, that we wanted to come out and put a list of substances on the hit list, and then that was it, and devil take the hindmost. Even if you find out later on that what you did, you know, worked counter to what you were trying to do, that there's no easy way to retreat from it. And the bill is not structured in that way. The bill is structured in such a way as, or it's intended anyway, that if you do decide that a particular industrial use of a substance ought to be stopped and something substituted for it, and if you do find out at a later time that what you did made the situation worse, not better, you're going to adjust for that. That's the approach we tried to take.
Thank you. Well, as you can see, we're right at the end of our time period, and I don't actually see any more questions, so the timing was perfect.
There is one more question.
There is? Where? Maybe you better go and read it. I'm not getting it.
It's a question. We really want to reproduce the green chemistry training in California. Can we use the training materials?
Absolutely. And I will, as soon as I get off the webinar, I will email you the link.